So thank you all for coming. The school has given us permission from this podium to take these off, but I'm going to ask that everyone please enjoy these lovely masks. I know you really favor them. I got my hook to my earring. So let's go ahead and start. My name is Miriam Maldonado, and I'd like to welcome you to the Workforce Council of Greater Houston's program this evening on who's responsible for the world's refugees, with Dr. Kelsey Norman. She's the Director of Women's Rights, Human Rights, and Refugees Programs at Rice University's Baker Institute. You'll hear more about her background in just a moment. So very appreciative that you stay with us. Program here in the Katy area, and thank you to Bill and the Village School and Chantal, who is probably somewhere. Oh, there she is. Thank you for your help. We are so honored to be here and to engage with the community here, as well as the students. So thank you again, Bill, for that. We really appreciate it. We are expanding kind of in all different areas and all different regions. We've not foregone doing things in Central Houston, so please continue to visit us there. But you might find us up in the Woodlands, here in Katy, maybe in Sugar Land, who knows where else. So we want to make sure we're touching the right communities and coming out to you where you live and work. Before we proceed, I'd like to tell you a few programs upcoming that we have on the roster. We have an excellent program on U.S. involvement in the Middle East and current affairs between the U.S. and those nations, as well as we have the chairman of the U.S. House Committee on Intelligence, Adam Schiff, speaking at one of our events on global resurgence of autocracy. And we also have U.S. Representative Dan Crenshaw will be joining us on speaking on U.S. national security and global leadership. We have a fabulous Global Young Professionals program led by my colleague back in the back, Jahan. So if you're a young professional in the audience, or if you're at home and you want to engage with some young professionals who enjoy global affairs, please connect with Jahan at our office. As well, we have a fabulous luncheon program. It's going to be a Fogo de Chao, just here on Westheimer, on global energy transition with a focus on Brazil. And lastly, if you've not traveled with us, I know some of you have, we have upcoming programs open now in 2022. And you can join us to go to Saudi Arabia, Ukraine, Moldova. I think Egypt is on the list, as well as Dubai, Bahrain. And so you can find all of the programs that we have ongoing. We add to them almost every single day. But check out our website, wachhouston.org, and bring a friend. So with that, let's go ahead and begin the formal start of tonight's program. It's my honor and privilege to welcome Mr. Phil Delosier, who will introduce our speaker this evening.
Well, good evening, and to echo Mary Ann's thoughts, welcome. It's really a treat to be here at the Village School, and we have a wonderful speaker tonight. I was just marveling reading her bio that all of you probably saw online, and I'll just hit a couple of the high points. But Dr. Kelsey Norman is a fellow for Middle East and director of Women's Rights, Human Rights, and Refugees Program at Rice University's outstanding Baker Institute of Public Policy. She's the author of a wonderful book, Reluctant Reception, Refugees, Migration, and Governance in the Middle East and North Africa, which was published just this year in 2021. An essay-length version of her book, Asylum Can't Be Outsourced, The Danger of Politically Convenient Solutions to Migration, recently won a big award in 2020, the 2021 Perry World House and Foreign Affairs Emerging Scholar Policy Prize. Hopefully the Astros will be as successful this next week as she has been. I was going to say that Dr. Norman is also published in many publications, academic publications. If you go online, I did myself on her website and was really impressed. So congratulations to her. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kelsey Norman.
Hey, thank you so much for having me here today. It's such a pleasure. I've heard so much about the World Affairs Council, and I'm so honored to get to speak a bit about my research tonight. So, for that introduction, I'm going to give you a little bit of a taste of this book that came out this year with Cambridge University Press. So it's on, oh, sorry, I forgot. As a speaker, I'll go ahead and remove my mask. No permission to do that. So I'll speak a bit about sort of some of the themes of my book. I won't go into too much depth about anything. And I'll also kind of borrow from this essay that I have that will be forthcoming in Foreign Affairs about how asylum can't be outsourced, the dangers of politically convenient solutions to migration. And I'll try to convince you of this thesis. So we'll walk through a whole bunch of things tonight, and I definitely look forward as well to your questions following the presentation. So I'll begin with this photo, and I think when we think about migration and when we think about refugees, we're so often confronted with visuals like this one. So this is from the New York Times, or it was published in the New York Times, and it's a photo of the 2015 quote-unquote crisis. So when a mass number of Syrians, but also other nationalities, attempted to cross from Turkey to Greece. And we'll talk more about that crisis moment going forward. But I show this today because I think these are most often kind of visuals that come to mind when we think about refugees. Usually it's journeys like this one, maybe a sea journey, maybe a land journey, such as at our own US border with Mexico. But so often we think about trajectories of migrants and refugees headed towards countries of the global north, countries in Europe, maybe the US, maybe Canada, maybe Australia. But usually that's what we think about, right? But if we think about 2015 specifically and Syrians specifically, you can see from this infographic that even at the height of Europe's crisis in 2015 and going into 2016, it was really actually a minority of Syrian nationals that arrived in countries of Europe. So from the green bubbles here, you can see the number of asylum applications that were filed by Syrians between 2015 and 2016, that sort of crisis moment. And the much larger circles in red represent the number of Syrians that were living in countries of the Middle East, specifically in the case of Syrians, Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan at the time. So again, when we think about crisis, I think we need to be pretty critical of that word, right? Was it a crisis in Europe compared to what was also going on at the same time in countries of the global south, specifically countries of the Middle East? And this really speaks to a larger phenomenon. So again, when we think about international migration broadly speaking, most often we think about migration from countries of the global south to countries of the global north. And you can see from the graph on the left that it is true that the majority of migration does go in that direction. So most migrants in the world, people who leave their countries of origin, do end up in countries of the global north. But it's only about half, right? So we're missing sort of half of the other picture, south-south migration, if you will. And this is, of course, even much more pronounced in the case of refugees. And we'll talk about that terminology in a minute, what it means to be a refugee versus a migrant. But if we just think about this infographic on the right, the number of global refugees in the world, 86% of whom live in countries of the global south. So the vast, vast majority are living in developing countries. It's really only a small number that end up in countries like Europe or countries like the US, despite those overwhelming images that we see in the media. So, tonight, the question I was posed is, who is responsible for the world of refugees? And part of that graph on the right you just saw speaks to the fact that within the global refugee regime, which basically has been in place since World War II, so since the 1950s, or since post-World War II, I should say, there's been this understanding of what we call the Grand Compromise. So this is basically a system whereby wealthier countries in the global north effectively pay for the hosting of refugees in countries of the global south. And that's somewhat worked in some instances, but it creates this, perverse inequality, both for countries of the global south, but also for refugees, of course, themselves as well. And we'll see that tension play out, and that's partly what we're going to talk about tonight. So, first I'm going to just go over some terminology that's important, and there's a lot of confusion, I think, about some of these terms, especially in the media and the way we consume information about refugees. Then I'm going to talk about some recent trends, and this is heavily borrowed from my own research on specifically the Mediterranean region. But I do also want to talk about North America, because we actually see so many of the same patterns at play because of our own US policies and the effect that they have on countries like Mexico or countries of Central America. And then lastly, we'll talk about how to move forward from here. What are possible solutions? Okay, so to begin, let's talk a little bit about the 1951 Convention. So maybe some of you are already familiar with this definition, but basically the 1951 Convention, think about the time period. It's post-World War II. This set forward the definition of who gets to qualify as a refugee under international law, and then most countries adopted it domestically as well. So the first important, this is a lot of text, I realize, but the first important part that's in bold here is that individuals are going to qualify for refugee status if they meet one of these 5 criteria. So they need to be persecuted based on race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. And especially that political opinion piece, we can think of, the time period in which this was happening was the Cold War, right? So most commonly, refugees were coming from communist countries, seeking refuge in Western countries, and that political persecution part was sort of, parcel with this definition and how it was applied at the time. So it made sense for a time. The second part that's important, though, is that it says an individual needs to be outside his or her country of nationality, right? So you can't qualify for refugee status from within your own country. You have to leave. And just leaving is really difficult for so many people, right? We're talking about really difficult, dangerous, violent situations. So if you can't leave, and you still have to flee your home, you might be considered an internally displaced person, but you're not going to qualify as a refugee. And the last part is this important aspect of, you have to be unable or at least unwilling to return to your home country. So it's seeking refugee status is supposed to be a sort of long-term solution, at least while there's a situation in your home country that prevents you from returning to it. Okay, so let's talk a bit about how these categories break down. So as we just said, based on the definition, a refugee is someone who is fleeing for these 5 specific reasons, right? I call it my says 5 reasons. But we can think about in our modern day and age, in the 21st century, how these 5 listed don't necessarily encompass lots of reasons why people might have to leave their home country, right? What's a big one? I guess this isn't necessarily interactive, but we can think of a big one being climate change, right? That's always in the news nowadays in terms of why someone, let's say in a village, who's, if they're in the farming business, how their crop might fail due to climate change, and that might economically force them to leave and seek solutions elsewhere. That's not someone who's going to qualify as a refugee, right? Or someone who's escaping a natural disaster that's caused by climate change. We can also think about sort of generalized violence or wars in which maybe the fighting has technically stopped, but the economic devastation following a civil war, for example, might be a situation that forces someone to flee their country. But again, they might not qualify then as a refugee. So it's actually quite a narrow definition, this 1951 Convention. Okay, an asylum seeker is someone who is they have also left their home country, so step 1, but they're seeking refugee status. They haven't yet been granted refugee status, right? Or at least their claim has not yet been evaluated and substantiated. So in the context of developing countries of the global south, where I conduct most of my research, an asylum seeker is often someone who has maybe approached the UN, because oftentimes in developing countries, the UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, is the body that actually evaluates the claims of refugees, rather than a host country government. So maybe someone's approached the UN, and they've asked for refugee status, or they've asked to be evaluated for refugee status, but they haven't yet been granted it. So they're in that sort of limbo period. And they're usually entitled to sort of some protections, but not full protections that a refugee status would grant them. But it also applies in the context as individuals maybe who are crossing the U.S. border with Mexico. They've arrived at a port of entry, or they've actually made it into the U.S., and they approach a U.S. official or border patrol officer saying, I want to seek asylum. So I want to be considered or evaluated as a refugee, right? So that's someone, again, who hasn't been substantiated yet, but who would like to begin that process. And then we have the catch-all category of migrant, which is it's not a legal definition. It's basically just used as a term for everyone else who doesn't really fit these other definitions. And the problem here is that but in reality, someone might flee for reasons that they think they can't, they don't think that they can return to their home country, but if they don't meet these rather narrow definitions, they're just going to end up falling into this catch-all category of migrant. And we see this confusion play out in the media, right, about what these terms actually mean. So this is it's a little bit blurry, so I apologize, but this is an article from 2015 in The Guardian where the headline reads, refugees, are they migrants? And the reality is we don't know, right? Because they're individual human beings and they travel together on these routes in order to seek protection or to seek opportunities. And we don't know what they're seeking or what they're doing until we have a chance to actually evaluate their claims for asylum or their likelihood of getting refugee status. So that's why you see a lot of these terms being used kind of interchangeably, especially in media. And I just want to talk briefly about this process of refugee resettlement, which maybe some of you are familiar with. I think it in order to obtain refugee resettlement, in order to be considered for refugee resettlement, I'm just going to talk about an example based on some of the work I've done in Egypt. It's one of the countries that my book is based on. So refugees and asylum seekers arriving from various countries, especially from Horn of Africa countries or from Syria, might arrive in Egypt. Okay? So the first step, as we said, is to leave your country of origin, which we also said is not necessarily that easy. But if you can manage it, then you might arrive in a host country, let's say Egypt, whether regularly or maybe you had to pay a smuggler in order to cross the border. Regardless, when you first arrive, you're going to be a migrant, right? You haven't approached the UN yet, right? So you're considered a migrant at that point in time. But then maybe you find out about the UNHCR. You find out about this whole process of refugeehood and want to apply for it. But I spoke with individuals in Cairo, for example, who had lived in Cairo for 2 years before they learned about the UN. Even though they eventually qualified as refugees, initial process of registration. They take information about you, they take your name, the reason you left, all these other details, right? At that point, you're considered an asylum seeker. So you're seeking this refugee status. Now, then you're told to wait. You have to wait for the UN to give you a status or a determination status appointment whereby they'll actually collect all your information and really evaluate your story and decide, do you really qualify as a refugee or not? And I spoke with, for example, again in Cairo, I spoke with individuals told to wait 5 years as an asylum seeker just to even find out whether you might qualify for refugee status, right? Okay, so maybe you go through an RDC interview and eventually you actually do become a refugee. You are given that status. So again, this is 7 years from when you originally left your country where you were a migrant and then you were an asylum seeker, and now only then have you become a refugee. So again, these categories, people can be the same person, have the same background, but still transfer from these categories based on and then, so this is when you become a refugee in that country. It doesn't mean that you're guaranteed resettlement, because actually only less than 1% of the world's refugees are ever resettled to a country in the global north. Less than 1%, so it's very, very slim chances. But let's say you do end up getting selected, so the UN has declared you a refugee. They'll pass on your file, they'll kind of shop your file around to different countries, including the US, and then the US gets to choose who they want to accept you or not. So the refugee is not choosing. A whole bunch of screening checks, health checks, further evaluation of whether you really qualify as a refugee, and only then would you actually be able to come to the US or come to Germany or come to Sweden, etc. So it's quite a lengthy process, and I just want to hit home this point that people can go through different categories of status, right, depending on where they are in the time period. Okay, so next we're going to talk about some recent trends from the Mediterranean region. The creation of the Schengen Agreement. So this is several decades old, but it's important for thinking about some of the implications. So the Schengen Agreement, some of you are, I'm sure, familiar. Basically, it's an agreement that allowed for Europe to open up its internal borders. So if you're, I don't know what citizenships you all have, but if you have a US passport, you could fly to France and then cross into Germany without ever going through a border check, right? Because within the European Union, there's this fortify and close off its external borders. Okay, so that meant a few things. It meant offering fewer visas, fewer regular work visas for people coming from all the other countries in the world, especially Sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East, North Africa. It also meant that Europe took steps to physically fortify its external borders. And it didn't just do this through, building walls or gates or checking checkpoints. It also did it by bringing on board these sort of all of its neighborhood was brought on board, and Europe basically asked them, or sort of coerced them in some cases, to police Europe's external borders for Europe. And it did that through a variety of incentives. We can talk about one in the Q&A if you're curious. But the impact, which is sort of part of the focus of my research, is that migrants and refugees, hoping originally maybe to travel up to Europe, found themselves stuck in countries for periods of time. Okay? So even though this map I know shows you these arrows leading right up to Europe, the reality is people sort of ended up along its periphery, and it's actually really hard and really dangerous and really costly to cross into Europe. Okay, this is important when we think about 2015 in this particular moment. So, as you can, I hope, see, there's sort of two sets of numbers here. There's numbers that are in red and there's numbers that are in black. So the the year before this crisis moment. And you can see that at that point, the Central Mediterranean route was the most popular, the most frequently used. But the Central Mediterranean route is very dangerous. So it's either going from Libya or from Tunisia up towards Italy, and it's quite long, it's quite a long distance. It takes a long time on a boat, and there's lots of sinkings and lots of potential for sort of disaster. But there were some changes in 2015 that made the Eastern Mediterranean this drastic rise in numbers of people taking this route instead. So you can see the number here crossing, I hope you can see, the Eastern Mediterranean route, basically from Turkey to Greece, in 2014 was about 50,000. And then in 2015, it goes up to 885,000. So quite a quick and sudden increase that Europe didn't really see it coming. So this is going on kind of throughout the summer of 2015. And there's this building. But in August 2015, towards the end of August, there was the body of Aylan Kurdi, who was a young Syrian boy who drowned when his family was trying to cross from Turkey to Greece by boat. It's only about 4 miles, but it can be quite dangerous crossing. So his body was photographed on a Turkish beach, and this photograph was in every single paper across the world, right? And it was this moment of shame for Europe. Shame at sort of Europe was going to change its course. There was a speech, maybe some remember, from Angela Merkel about we will let people stay. We're not going to send. So under the normal protocols in Europe, people who arrived in countries like Germany or Sweden would be sent back to Italy and Greece, the countries that people first arrived in. But instead, Angela Merkel said, no, we're going to let people stay. So there was this moment of we're gonna do this. We're gonna figure out a way to resettle people who make it here. So Merkel sort of spearheads this European coalition of willing member states to figure out this allocation scheme. Which countries are going to take how many people? How are we going to make this work, right? But then we see some, even just by September, we see some backlash against that, particularly from Slovakia's Prime Minister, Robert Fico, but then other countries kind of follow suit, France, Sweden, Austria. And then, if you recall, on November 13th, which were horrifying, which had their intended effect of causing terror. And unfortunately, also at one of the scenes of one of the attacks, there was a Syrian passport that turned out later on it was planted there. But it led to this association between we let all these asylum seekers in, we told them they could stay, and this is the result, right? But of course, that was the intended effect, the intended consequence of the terrorists. Anyhow, regardless, within a matter. So one of them, if you recall, was the 2015 Trust Fund for Africa. So this was basically Europe got together, the EU got together, member states got together, and put together this pot of 6 billion euros. And the idea was that Europe is going to give this money to countries across sub-Saharan Africa, across North Africa, even other places potentially. And we're going to pay countries to develop further so that people don't want to leave in the first place. Of asylum seekers as well as migrants towards Europe. So that was one approach, and we call this kind of a root causes logic. It's like if we can develop countries further, people won't want to leave, right? But we don't. I mean, in academic literature, we're pretty skeptical of this because we don't really know that that's the case. We think there is actually maybe the inverse relationship, whereby if people have a little bit more opportunity, a little bit further resources, they might actually be further incentivized to migrate, at least in the short term. And negotiations began in November 2015, so right after the Paris attacks, but concluded in March 2016. And this was a deal struck whereby Syrians who arrived in Greece would be able to be sent back to Turkey. Even though they'd made the journey, they'd arrived on the EU soil, they had a right to claim asylum. They were then going to be sent back to Turkey under this deal. And Turkey would get all sorts of things. Turkey got up to 6 billion euro, as well as of the accession negotiations, so Turkey possibly joining the European Union. A lot of that hasn't come to fruition, but nonetheless, this deal was sort of put forth as a model that Europe saw as a very effective way to prevent asylum seekers as well as migrants from getting to Europe. And in the vein of that deal, we see another deal struck the following year with Libya. So the EU had previously made deals with Libya, but this was a lot more money. Several competing governments because Libya was in the midst of a civil war at the time. So basically the Libyan Coast Guard was going to be paid and further supplied with weapons as well as sort of other infrastructure to intercept boats of asylum seekers and migrants and take them back to Libya. But later it was exposed that not only were some migrants and asylum seekers being held in really, really poor conditioned detention facilities, but some were actually even being sold into slavery. The Middle East and North Africa, kind of name a country in the region, and there's a deal being struck by Europe to cooperate with that country on migration and on migration prevention. And I think some of my new research looks at the consequences of this. So what are the consequences of dealing with the government, like the Egyptian government at the moment, which has all sorts of human rights abuses, right? Or what are the consequences of giving money to the Sudanese government, especially pre-2019, but also questionably now? So in 2016, Kenya, which hosts one of the world's largest refugee camps, the Dog Refugee Camp, basically threatened to shut the camp down and send the primarily Somali nationals that live there back to their home country where they could face violence and even death. And the Kenyan Ministry of the Interior released this statement in 2016 saying, governments across Europe and the Middle East have taken unprecedented efforts to limit refugee inflows into their countries on the grounds of national being drawn with the actions of Europe, which is basically sort of shirking its responsibility to refugees and its responsibility to asylum seekers, and saying, well, if you guys aren't going to host refugees, maybe we're not going to do it either, right? And at least, even if they weren't serious about closing down the camp, which ultimately they did not, they now see it as this way to sort of extract diplomatic and economic concessions from the European Union, right? And we see this kind of game being played now all across. Okay, so now we'll switch, and we'll talk about our own backyard a little bit. Okay. So we see a lot, I don't want to frame this all as only occurring under the former administration of President Trump. We certainly had deals with countries in Central America, countries in the Caribbean, countries in South America. At the time of everything that was happening in Europe, candidate Trump was making all sorts of sort of anti-refugee and anti-immigrant claims and promises, right? So on some of them, he carried through. So for one thing, he starts setting up these safe third country agreements. And these are quite similar, actually, to the Turkey deal, or even to the deal with Libya in some ways. So basically, this is that individuals, asylum seekers, Mexico, that individual who had to transit through Guatemala and Mexico in order to get to the U.S. could instead be sent back to Guatemala or to Mexico and told, you have to seek asylum there, you can't seek asylum in the U.S. And you might ask, well, what are the asylum systems like in Guatemala and Mexico? And they do exist, however, they are not at capacity to support large numbers of asylum seekers, nor can we necessarily say that having to remain in a country like Mexico at the moment of these types of deals under former President Trump, with Guatemala, Mexico, Nicaragua, Honduras, and El Salvador. We also saw the MPP program, the Migration Protection Protocols. Maybe some of you are familiar. So basically, this was another way to kind of force people to look for other options besides seeking asylum in the U.S. So if someone managed to make it to the U.S. border between Mexico and the U.S. and asked to seek asylum, have to just stay in Mexico until that time. And so, of course, this leads to like a huge backlog, people living in all sorts of tenuous and dangerous circumstances along the U.S.-Mexico border, and basically no end in sight of when they're actually going to be able to seek asylum properly in the U.S. And there were sort of a number of other practices that were used under the Trump administration during this time. Another one being used by the Trump administration, and now by the Biden administration too, is the use of Title 42. Coronavirus pandemic to tell people that you can't actually cross the border for health reasons, you have to go back to Mexico. So sort of another broader way to force people to remain in Mexico. And candidate Biden promised that he would reverse this, but he has not yet. And actually, a number of rights groups took Title 42 to a court just recently, and it was overturned, but then the Biden administration sought to have it reinstated. So they're quite adamant. Quite seemingly unlawful policy. So these are just some recent headlines about that issue. Okay, let's, with our remaining 10 minutes or so, talk about some avenues forward. So one thing I just want to bring up is that, it might surprise you, but according to this most recent Gallup poll from 2020, for the first time in Gallup's history of polling on the issue of how Americans feel about migration or immigration, less immigration. So you see it's basically those who want migration increase is this brown line, and those who want migration decrease is this sort of grayish line. So you can see it's actually going down, and this has been kind of on an upward trajectory. But I bet you wouldn't think that, right, from the way that migration is talked about in media and by politicians in this country. And I think part of that has to do with the kind of rhetoric that we use around migration. So just surge from Belarus. This next one says, when migrants arrived in droves, this poor New Mexico city opened its arms. And the subtitle is, the city of Deming has marshaled all of its resources to cope with a steady influx of migrants. And then the last one says, Spain says flood of migrants from Morocco is serious crisis. So if you notice, there's a lot of water metaphors that are being used, right? Why is it we always have to talk about migrants? You immediately feel this sense of fear and panic, and that you might think is intentional. But I mean, this is used across media, right, left, whatever. And I think I understand journalists want to sort of express the gravity of issues, but there's also this sensationalist aspect to this, right? And so I think when we as readers read these kinds of headlines, we should read further and say, well, how many people? Okay, you're talking about 4,000 people in the context. Change, at least we as consumers can think about it more critically. So another thing that I think would help, or that we can talk about at least, and another way, I guess I should say that means of physically getting people from countries of the global south to countries of the global north, as we talked about earlier when I talked about the steps that are involved in resettlement, right? So for a long time, the U.S. was the leader in refugee resettlement. It resettled the largest number of refugees globally, up until this drop-off we see under the former President Trump. So currently, in fiscal year 2021, we had the lowest intake or arrivals of. President Biden campaigned on raising that ceiling. So we talked about the blue line is the ceiling, and then the orange line is the number of people that actually arrived that year. So Biden talked about raising the ceiling. However, in I think it was May, he then sort of backtracked on that and said, actually, we're not going to raise it for fiscal year 2021 because of the pandemic. And there was this enormous outcry from refugee advocates, from sort of, I think, a wide swath of supporters, and he backtracked. He said, okay, sorry, we are going to raise refugee ceiling. So he's promised to bring that number up to 125,000 for fiscal year 2022. And of course, that's the ceiling. We have to sort of continue with this momentum of putting pressure on the Biden administration to actually make sure that that ceiling is adhered to, that we actually bring in that many people. But I think it's really important our involvement in a 20-year war there, and given all the allies that were going to be at risk because of their work with our military and with journalists and others. But I think it also illustrates that if we care about an issue, if we want to make it happen, we have the resources. It's just a matter of allocating them. And I think there's sort of two ways to see the Afghan rescue mission. I know refugee advocates in the U.S. were horrified at how slow it all operated, how under visa program. All of last spring, there was sort of no movement on that, and only once we got close to Kabul falling did we actually step in and get, physically work to get people out. But at the same time, it can also, I think, be illustrative of, we have the capacity when we want it to be there. And on that issue, though, of those we didn't get out, people, women's rights defenders, I want to say is that some people who didn't get out by plane, who didn't get out via the Kabul airport, will look for other ways out, right? And that's going to most likely involve going to neighboring countries, as it always does in crisis situations. So as we saw with Syria, most people ended up in Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan, right? Not in Europe. And it's the same, of course, with Afghans, who are most likely going to end up in Pakistan and Iran and other neighboring countries. So another way we can support countries that are doing the most work, but also walking that fine line between not just giving them blank checks that might not actually benefit the refugees living there. And I'm going to end on sort of a final point that, this is a little bit blurrier than I wanted it to be, unfortunately. But I love this graph because I think it illustrates some important points for thinking about the global refugee regime, but also the global migratory regime, broadly speaking. Okay, so the country that someone is born, your life chances, all the opportunities you have. There's nothing that matters as much as the citizenship that you hold. So you can understand, in a world that looks like this, where I'll just point it out in case you can't read it. So this shows 73% of the world's income and 14% of the world's population live in these global, concentrated more or less in the global south. So if all of your life, you can talk about forced migration, things like violence or civil wars that force people to leave. Other times it's situations that, again, don't quite fit that refugee definition, but nonetheless drive people to migrate. And I think if we're going to be serious about challenging this sort of political football of migration, we have to talk about a more equitable world in terms of visa regimes. So travel to most countries in the world without a visa, right? Just as an example, an Egyptian can travel to 15 countries in the world without a visa. So in order to get a visa, you have to have all sorts of resources. You have to have educational resources. You have to have financial resources. You have to have social resources. So it's not actually that easy for lots of people in the world to travel. And I think if we really want to sort of, countries are very worried about minimizing irregular migration, and the real way to do that is to make legal migration more equitable.
Kelsey, thank you so much for that. My colleagues had just passed out some of these yellow question cards, so definitely highly recommend if you have any questions to ask the brilliant Dr. Norman, please definitely feel free to do that. But to get us, you can say that, however we want to do it. But essentially, we've got a few questions. Of refugees get resettled in the global north. What are the parameters or attributes that the U.S. and others look for from the large pool of candidates processed by the UN?
Great question. Yeah, a colleague and I, Lama Murad, and I actually have a paper looking at this because allegedly the qualifications are supposed to be that the world's most vulnerable refugees get resettled, right? And different countries define vulnerability in different ways. To include things that you might not think about as necessarily vulnerable. So things like work experience, language skills, education. And you kind of think, that sounds a lot like other tracks of immigration, right? Less so related directly to vulnerability. So what we're arguing in this paper we have is that it really needs to be about vulnerability, and it can't just, refugee resettlement can't be just another way to get sort of the best and brightest U.S. Social and cultural fabric, but that shouldn't be the basis upon which a refugee is selected for resettlement. These are individuals who sort of meet, again, quite narrow criteria and can't go back to their home countries for specific reasons, and thus are in need of protection rather than are in need of being used for sort of their economic and educational attainment.
Do you think we need to update the 1951 refugee definition? If yes, what might it be?
Yeah, that's about how can we utilize a broader definition, and other countries do. So there's the Cartagena, I don't know if actually it's accord or anyway, an agreement that certain countries in South America have adopted, which is a somewhat broader definition of who can qualify. Certain countries in Africa have also adopted a broader definition. So it's actually predominantly Western countries who strictly adhere to like a more narrow definition, although there is some based on domestic court cases, right? And that can change with politics. So under former President Trump, Jeff Sessions, as Attorney General, took steps to kind of minimize who could qualify. For example, women fleeing gendered violence were no longer going to be able to qualify. So it can kind of change with different court cases and with different political parties in power. But in terms of your question about a global, we opened it up for discussion, we might end up with something even narrower in our current day and age, right? So I think for me, it's actually maybe more important to think about opening up more legal routes that individuals could use, even if they don't necessarily meet those qualifications for refugee status. So looking for alternative pathways, education, work opportunities, etc., in lieu of necessarily adopting the 1951 or changing. Maybe slightly more open space, maybe that would be a time to reassess it, but I don't think the current moment is the time for that.
Right. So you did mention equitable quite a bit in your talk. How would you define equitable?
In terms of opportunities?
Yeah.
I think, again, if we're talking about sort of opportunities for movement, I think the last slide I had up just kind of illustrates the inequality of your citizenship, even if it's to go seek a educational opportunity somewhere or a work opportunity or family reunification opportunities, there's a huge inequality in terms of who gets to do that and who doesn't. I think the pandemic has made that even more pronounced. And now this vaccine inequality is going to make it even more pronounced. And I think we're just moving in a dangerous direction where it's going to incentivize more and more irregular movement. When that's the only opportunity that people have.
Apply for an SIV.
I'm sorry, can you repeat it?
Yeah. What are the precedents in international law for illegal or under the table dealing/extortions when moving asylum seekers who would qualify / have applied for an SIV? Okay, well, it wouldn't be so much international law in that instance. So the SIV process was something started both in the context of Iraq and also in the context of who worked with the U.S. military, right, or military contractors, or maybe in some cases worked with like NGOs that were contracted by the military. And if anything, there was a huge amount of vetting involved in all the individuals who wanted to come under that program, right? If anything, it was so exclusionary that so many people, had clearly worked for the U.S. government or U.S. government contractor, but then they had, in applying for the program, they had to demonstrate that, and sometimes they couldn't even for resettlement. Like in a lot of cases that I specifically heard about or read about, it was just the onus was always on the potential applicant themselves rather than on the former employer to provide that information. Although there are incredible stories, right, of Marines or other U.S. military members who fought so hard to try and get their former interpreters or other employees out, and yet they were so frustrated by this bureaucratic system that they're this is such a concern because it just seemed that the onus was so heavy in terms of security and concern, any potential security concerns that someone might pose
in coming to the U.S. that if there was even the slightest hint of a possibility of a security concern, they were denied. So I don't think, I just don't know if that was as much of a concern as like, well, how do we get the people that don't pose any security concerns who did assist in the military who tried so hard to get their interpreters out and weren't able to in time.
So I'm just going to ask this one last question, unless anyone else has any other questions that they might want to add while I'm asking this question. Hint, hint. With the Syrian civil war seeming to have reached a difficult reality that Assad will stay in power and ultimately own most of the country, essentially, with relatively lower levels of violence, do you expect many Syrians to return?
That's a great question. I think there's a number of aspects to that. So some have already returned. Like that's been going on for a while. Others have been forcibly returned by countries like Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey. Even countries in Europe now have moved to return Syrians to Syria, even at the current moment. So it's an ongoing situation. It's not that it's just going to suddenly come about. But it always is a looming. Currently happening, they no longer want to host Syrians. But there will be some individuals who stay. Like even in Turkey, some Syrians have already obtained Turkish citizenship. In Lebanon, some have sort of de facto, maybe through marriage, maybe through some other kind of connection, have managed to sort of gain residency status in Lebanon, and same in Jordan. So I mean, some people have found means by which to sort of, haphazardly or sort of de facto integrate into new host countries. But I do think just to go back to some of the slides I showed you, the repercussions of that moment in 2015 when Europe sort of shirked its responsibility. One of the repercussions I didn't talk about was that in Lebanon, there became this sort of standoff of Lebanon basically forcibly deporting Syrians back to Syria, despite knowing that those who either escaped conscription or had any kind of interaction with the Syrian opposition group would potentially be killed. Primarily comes the money for the UN primarily comes from European donors, or the UNHCR, I should say. Even under pressure from the UNHCR, it became evident that the EU and the UN just really didn't have the same sway with Lebanon that they had previously, because Lebanon kind of looked at it as like, well, you guys aren't doing anything, and you're not even necessarily going to pay us enough to keep the situation going. This is a politically challenging domestic situation for us, so we're just going to go ahead and deport. The EU, setting that example, or in the U.S. case, the U.S. setting that example of, we're not going to, at the time of former President Trump, we're not going to take Syrians, they're political hazard or terrorists or whatever was said at the time. That's heard by countries in the global South, right? It doesn't happen in a vacuum, and it's setting an example whereby Syrians can kind of be returned with impunity.
Amazing. Any last questions?
Sorry, just write it. Considering the long-term effect of low fertility in China, where do we see China fitting in this in the long term?
Within like the U.S. or in the global refugee regime?
Yes, I mean at some point in time they're going to not have enough workers because their economy is expanding so much, and they got a lot of old people and not enough people in the working age. So I'm wondering if they had incentive to, I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. To be honest, it's not one that I've thought about. And for example, the Gulf countries are very small but very wealthy countries, right? And they got a lot of pushback because they didn't take Syrians when it's in their own neighborhood and why, etc. But they argue their role is more to financially support countries that are hosting Syrians. So they see themselves as more as sort of, I guess, in the case of the North-South divide, more as global North actors, right? And I wonder if China would kind of see itself as, well, we'll invest some money, but I don't know about how they would feel about actually taking in like Syrian nationals, for example. Maybe they will take a different stance on refugee resettlement or greater involvement in the refugee regime. That's a good question.
Amazing. Any other? Yes, Casey.
Can I respond to this question a little bit?
Sure. Do you mind if I close out the program really quick before? Okay, amazing. Well, I just want to thank our host. Well, first of all, my name is Tatiana Nicholas. I am a program coordinator for the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston. Thank you guys so much on the west side in Katy and in Sugar Land. Definitely check out our website at wachhouston.org to see some of the other stuff that we have going on. And once again, thank you so much, Dr. Norman, for coming out and trying to answer the ultimate question of who's responsible for the world's refugees. I'm sure you'll probably be here for a few minutes after.
Sure. Yeah.
In case anyone has any other pressing questions that they didn't feel comfortable to ask on a question card or it just came to you. Thank you guys again, and hopefully we will see you again soon.
Thank you. Oh, great.
I guess we'll let them clear up any of the questions that they left already solved.
Yes, I agree. Yeah, so if you want, I actually have my card. You can send me an email, and I can definitely put you in touch with our new educational coordinator. And I know he'll be in touch either way, but it's this way I'll be free up.
The cultural side of it is really
For sure. Well, I'm glad you're able to come over here. Yep, stay with me. I actually have a friend that went here before. Everything K through 12. She ended up going to Yeah, she actually did, back whenever there was like bus routes.
And I'll tell you, I realize you still have like 5 more minutes.
There are no more questions. I can tell that she has that style of I think she had that thing.
No, it's all good. We had a speaker here a few times ago, maybe 6 months. You didn't stop it?
No, the battery died.
There's no way it died. It didn't die. It just fell asleep.
I just agree.